Dr. Narda here, and in this video we are going to talk about human development. And really, what does human development focus on? What do developmental psychologists study? Well, stay tuned and we'll find out together. So if you're a psychologist studying human development, you might ask questions like, how did life begin? How did a human grow from a single cell to a complex adult? How does your environment influence how you develop? Also, how do you deal with death and dying? These are all issues that come up in human development because human development consists of many complex sets of factors. Very fundamentally, we can think of three of these: nature and nurture, continuity versus discontinuity, and we can also talk about context-specific development and universal development. And in this video, we will touch on all of these topics. Now, we think about nature versus nurture. It kind of comes down to the question of, are you a product of your genes or are you a product of your environment? That is actually a very complex question and a little beyond this video, but most psychologists would agree that it's a combination of nurture and nature, something we refer to as epigenetics. We often look at how your genes influence your environment and your environment influences your genes. The other question that comes up in developmental psychology is related to continuity and discontinuity. Now, the biggest question is, do personal characteristics remain the same or do they progress smoothly? That would be the continuity part. Or are they a series of abrupt shifts, like discontinuity? We'll talk about various theories that look at development as continuity, as a continuing smooth progression. We'll also talk about development as abrupt shifts. The last issue that will come up is universal versus context-specific issues. Now, the biggest question here is about how many developmental paths are there? Are there one developmental path or are there several developmental paths? And whenever you think about development, I want you to think about four forces that affect human development. That would be biological factors, psychological forces, your social context, and the life cycle forces. Now, an amazing tool we have to kind of understand development, and a field that has emerged more recently, is the field of neuroscience and the tools that this field brings with it, like fMRIs or functional magnetic resonant imaging and EEGs. Now, neuroscience is simply the study of the brain and the nervous system, especially looking at the brain-behavior relationship. Now, we have neuroscientific approaches that have been applied to human development, such as looking at memory, reasoning, and emotion. Now, these methods might include things like molecular analysis and the aforementioned brain imaging techniques like fMRIs and EEGs. Now, we can think about developmental psychology organized around various theories. Now, a theory is just an organized set of ideas that are backed up by scientific research and scientific studies. Now, we could talk about 5 general theories of human development. Those include psychodynamic theory, learning theory, cognitive developmental theory, ecological and systems theory, and lifespan perspective and related theories. So this is kind of how we'll organize these videos, and I'll talk about some seminal theorists within each of these overarching categories. Now, housed within psychodynamic theory, often people think of Freud right away. However, there's other theorists that are housed within psychodynamic theory. One of the key theorists as it relates to development is Erik Erikson. And yes, Sigmund Freud as well. He is there. I will briefly talk about Erikson's theory of development. And Erikson really looked at epigenetic in terms of psychosocial stages. Now, briefly, Erik Erikson said there are 8 stages of psychosocial development. He talked about during birth to 1 year, there was trust versus mistrust. That was the first stage. Then about 1 to 3 years old, it was autonomy versus shame. Then the next stage was guilt versus initiative. And this is about 3 to 6 years old. And then we find about 6 years to adolescence, we have industry versus inferiority. Then he talked about during adolescence, we had identity versus identity confusion. And then during young adulthood, he talked about intimacy versus isolation. And then middle adulthood, he talked about stagnation versus generativity. And the last stage, he said, which was late in life, was integrity versus despair. Now, if you'd like me to go into depth related to this theory, leave a comment below, and I'll be happy to make a video about it. Another couple of theorists that were instrumental were B.F. Skinner, who was a behavioralist. And he really said that behavior was a function of its consequences. So depending on the outcome of a behavior, that would determine if the behavior occurs or is stopped. And another theorist that was instrumental for developmental psychologists was Albert Bendura and his social learning theory, or what it later became was the social cognitive theory of learning. And he emphasized that learning occurs through imitation and observation as well. Another theorist to look at in the field of developmental psychology would be Piaget. Piaget talked about cognitive development in children and how children developed in discrete stages, moving through different stages over time. There is also theories related to information processing, and they're related to human cognition. And often these researchers in the developmental theorist space talk about mental software and mental hardware, so like our brain, and then the mental software that runs on it, which would be our, cognitive processes. And they talk about how our cognitive abilities grow with age. For example, Vygotsky talked about how a child's cognitive abilities grow as they develop and as they get older. Now, there are also theorists who look at ecology, and one very famous theorist is Bronfenbrenner. He had the theory of how we develop within an embedded context. And his theory was Bronfenbrenner's theory of development. And actually, he talked about how there were spheres of influence that influenced our development, from our very closest system, which would be our parents, to all the way out to more proximal distance systems, for example, like the state or the country we live in. And again, if you'd like videos about any of these theories, please leave a comment down below, and I'd be happy to expand upon any theorists you've heard in this video thus far. Now, you might be wondering, how do developmental psychologists collect data? How do they do research? What are some tools that developmental psychologists use? And a couple that I will mention in this video is systematic observation. You could also use self-reports or other physiological measurements. And I will kind of touch upon each one of these broad measurement techniques. Now, we could do two different systematic observation techniques. You could do a naturalistic observation, where you observe someone in a real-life situation. You observe them within context. Or you could do a more contrived observation, or a very structured observation, which maybe you create it in a laboratory and you set it up and it's very artificial. Now, this has many pitfalls, especially if it's unnatural and unrealistic, and it might not be a good representation of how somebody might act in the real world compared to like a naturalistic observation. Now, the other thing you could do is you could do self-reports, which are fantastic. And these allow people to answer questions. Now, these could be in the forms of an actual questionnaire you hand somebody, or you do on the internet, and they can answer questions on like a Likert scale. This could be some kind of interview you do with them, and you can ask them questions. But the caveat with interviews is they're only good as the person interviewing is. because there's an art to it. And also, you have to think about a person's limitation on their ability to self-reflect and something we call social desirability, and how somebody might answer, especially if they think you're going to judge them on the way they answer. They might not be as honest as you would like. Now, the last technique I'll talk about in this video are physiological measures. Now, you could use brain imaging like fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance imaging. You could just use a heart rate monitor to look at heart rate changes. There are many tools you have. There's an EEG to look at brain waves. There's also a magnetic resonant imaging, which is just like a picture. Again, there are many different tools we can use to look at physiological measures of human development. And this, again, I think is an emerging field and has a lot of promise to answer future questions. So in conjunction with those types of tools we could use to collect data, we also have different types of research design, such as longitudinal designs, which follow an individual or individuals over a long period of time, could be as long as their whole lives, where you collect data at various points. There could also be cross-sectional designs where you have people who are, again, at different ages, but at the same time, and you put them into cohorts. So you might have a cohort of 70-year-olds, and you might have a cohort of 30-year-olds, and you might compare them. Or you could have what we call sequential studies, which are more complex, and they're kind of a mix of cross-sectional and longitudinal methods. Again, if you'd like me to go into more detail about any of these, please leave a comment below, and I will be happy to do so. But with that said, that's all for this video. Please like, subscribe, and share. Smash that like button, and I'll see you all next time. Take care, and bye for now.